All right, we are going to continue with our just sort of walk through Luke. We're calling it Discovering the Gospel of Luke, and we're doing it a little bit differently than maybe we have in that we're going to continue on what we're doing on our Sunday mornings, where we take time to listen to a portion of Scripture, do a little bit of retelling, though I want to do retelling today, hopefully if it works out a little different than we have in the last couple times, and you have to bear with me, to work with me on this, because I've not done it this way before. So audience participation in this is going to be key, so I'm going to warn you now. I'm hoping we can try this. But the whole reason we want to talk about this, we want to do this in this way, is something we've learned over the time, especially when we talked about how the brain works, and just the idea of good character, maturity. We are being formed whether we like it or not. So it's always good to try to be formed intentionally. That very much matters with the idea kind of relationships we have. They will form us. We might be surprised. You might say, no, they're not forming us. No, they will form us. It's the idea of we want to be intentional in that formation. Now, one of the things that we want to do as Jesus followers is we are going to be formed by each other, but we want to make sure that we are being formed by Jesus. And one of the tools that we have for that is the Bible. Specifically, those Gospels. They can be so helpful in forming us. We want to be intentional about it. And sometimes what that means is we got to sit there when we're reading the Bible, and I know I definitely can fall into this trap, but I'm sure many of you can attest to it. Life is busy. You just either don't, or you do a really quick read to say you marked off the calendar that I read something today. But as we know, sometimes that doesn't mean we've actually taken the time to be formed by it. It's just like we've kind of done our Christian duty. But we do want to take some time to slow down and be formed by it. And so that's a lot of what this whole idea of Discovery Bible Study is about, discovering the Gospel of Luke. So, we are in Luke 6. Now, Ron and I actually, we broke down this Luke 6 into two different parts. So, what already's been released, if you've been following along with the videos or podcasts, however you listen to that, we've actually covered the first few verses already, because it kind of makes a difference by the time where we are kind of around verse 20. But when we read, that's kind of where we're going to start off today, so we're around verse 20. Now, if you've read it before, you might say, hey, there's a lot of familiarity in this chapter, if you've read, say, Matthew. Because Luke 6 repeats, rewords, paraphrases a lot of stuff that we see if we've read Matthew. Now, the nice thing about Luke 6 is he does it in about a half a chapter, maybe 2/3 of a chapter, where Matthew takes 3 chapters. But we have a lot of overlap. We have things like blessings or the Beatitudes. Talk about loving enemies. We have the golden rule. We have judging others. We have building strong foundations. Matthew takes a lot more detail when he talks about these things. Luke's a little bit more direct. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to this, you might say, oh, did Luke just decide to leave things out from what Matthew talked about? Even as you go into the whole thing, it starts off similarly, and Jesus is talking to predominantly his disciples, followers, and then a crowd. However, Matthew talks about being on some sort of mount, and Luke actually says he comes down a mountain right after picking the 12 disciples, and says he's on a plain, to which he starts. Now, before we say, hey, which one is the original, which one is a copy, which one's more accurate, which one's less accurate, what happens is, and scholars have basically, I think for the most part agree with this, is that they really believe that Jesus had kind of a greatest hits, or kind of his these were the things he covered in most places. And so we're not getting the same sermon, we're getting similar sermon in a different location. Because there's a good chance what he did is that he did have sort of his main points, that wherever he went, he started talking about that. And obviously, like even people would today, depending upon location and the people around, you might modify it. Like if everyone does a talk today, if you were sitting in a room of professionals in whatever talk you're talking on, you might talk a little different, use different words than if you were just talking to the everyday sort of layman. Because they're not going to understand certain terminology and things like that, so you would change your approach. It's very much what we see Jesus doing. It's very likely he actually pretty much spoke a very similar sermon in a lot of the places that he went. Overlapping themes, probably targeting certain things if he knows the things that are going on, or feeling, again, being led by God himself. Now, maybe spend a little more time on this issue because this is maybe a little bit more pertinent to this location. Very much you could see that with Paul's writing. Obviously, Paul would write to different churches, and sometimes he would write similar things, or sometimes he's just directly not even only this place, because again, this group of people need to hear this certain thing. And so we do have some similarities, we do have some repetition. And so this is what we kind of have here with Luke 6. Luke 6 is familiar. Now, when studying the Bible, one of the things they say to do is whenever you hear something repeated, or it's in there more than once, there's probably a good reason for it. So the fact that Luke 6 has so many similarities to some other things he does throughout Luke, but definitely Matthew, is again, take note here, because, hey, it's repeated. Maybe there's something in here, maybe there's something important, and we got to sit there and maybe wrestle with it a little bit, contemplate it more, and figure out what does that mean for me in today's world and the life that I live. So, Luke 6, and we're going to set up the scene. Luke 6 starts off with two interactions with Pharisees and religious leaders about the subject of Sabbath. Then, in verse 12, Jesus will meet with his followers, and from those followers, pick a very specific 12. Luke actually calls them the apostles. And so this is where we have this idea that, yes, 12 were more that inner circle, more that closer, and even 3 in that circle were seemed a little closer. But a good chance, we don't know how many, there were many who would be maybe his disciples, follow him around, but it's the 12 that he put a focus on. It's 12 that he released maybe a little bit differently, as far as concerned maybe some sort of leadership or influence in the midst of the rest of them. And it's after that, Jesus comes down with his followers from the mountain. And this is where he basically starts talking about what we're going to listen to in just a moment. He's surrounded by his disciples. It says he's surrounded by his followers, and then what Luke calls the crowd. You're people that are from all over the place, Judea it says, Jerusalem, and then it says way up north to Tyre and Sidon. Now, this actually can give us a little key, because right now Jesus is in the Galilee area, and it says the people came from Jerusalem. And if we go back a couple chapters, we hear it took days to get from Galilee to Jerusalem based on when Jesus was 12 and they went to the temple for Passover. And it says it took about a 3-day journey. Now, I know for us, I know for Courtney and I, we have made journeys to see certain things. We saw a concert last year in Montana, 7-hour drive. We do lots of things that are really close. If you really want to think about it, in this area, it's not a big deal for us to say, oh, you know what, I want to make a day trip to Canmore. If you walk to Canmore, and I did this, it'll take approximately 26 hours. Now, I sit there, right now it takes an hour and maybe 15 minutes to get to Canmore from here. See, that seems doable. You could probably sit with someone and say, hey, you want to go to Canmore? Sure, without a lot of planning. However, if that walk took 26 hours, you might say, you know what, we need to think this through. We need to plan some stops. We need to bring provisions with us, because that's a long journey. From here to Saskatoon, 7 hours. Again, we do a little bit more thinking of that, but that's pretty easy to do. Now, if you walk that, several more hours than 7. So it's a big deal that people from Jerusalem have come to find Jesus. This is not a throw the backpack on the back, let's go for a walk today. This is a commitment. It's really big. And I would say, we might notice that here, living in Airdrie, this is what I noticed. Airdrie to Calgary is a short drive, but Calgary to Airdrie is really long. Because it's simply this. When you live in the big center, most of the things come to you. Very little, you have to go to it. So the fact that Jerusalem, there are probably lots of people who are like Jesus, who are these itinerant speakers. And most of them, they're probably coming to Jerusalem because that's the place to go. The fact that these people are like, hey, we're going to go find this person, says a lot about what they are feeling about Jesus. Because that's a commitment. Because they might say, you know what? Eventually he's going to come here. He's going to come here. I mean, this is it. When bands do Canadian tours, I'm pretty sure they only think Canada is Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, right? Jerusalem is either Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal. The band is coming there. Who's ever speaking, they're coming to Jerusalem eventually. So it's really big if they can't wait. They're going to spend the time, the money, and the effort to go all the way there. So they go there. You know, it is risky to travel at that point. It's gotten better because of the roads the Romans have done. That's why Paul utilizes it. But it doesn't mean it's not risky. It's a lot safer to travel now. But there's still people who hang out in roads and rob people, so there's that. And Jesus is there. And people have traveled from all over the place to hear him, to be healed by him. And when we listen, we're going to pick it up at verse 20. We're not going to listen to all of the rest of chapter 6. We're going to listen to about 20 verses. We're going to take that time. Now, here's the thing I want us to be ready. One, we are going to listen. It's going to be read to us in the NLT, so if you want to bring your phone out, the Bible, look at the YouVersion app. Chapter 6 of Luke, starting with verse 20. And after this, we're going to talk a little bit more, and then we're going to do the retelling. So I want us to sort of be ready as we're reading and listening, be thinking, because we're going to do the retelling together. So kind of be listening, kind of be thinking, I'm even highlighting a few things if you feel something jumps out at you. But kind of be ready, because we are together going to do the retelling. So we are going to look at this, 6:20 to 36.
Then Jesus turned to his disciples and said, God blesses you who are poor, for the kingdom of God is yours. God blesses you who are hungry now, for you will be satisfied. God blesses you who weep now, for in due time you will laugh. What blessings await you when people hate you and exclude you and mock you and curse you as evil because you follow the Son of Man? When that happens, be happy. Yes, leap for joy. For a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, their ancestors treated the ancient prophets that same way. What sorrow awaits you who are rich, for you have your only happiness now. What sorrow awaits you who are fat and prosperous now, for a time of awful hunger awaits you. What sorrow awaits you who laugh now, for your laughing will turn to mourning and sorrow. What sorrow awaits you who are praised by the crowds, for their ancestors also praised false prophets. But to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek also. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give to anyone who asks. And when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. If you love only those who love you, why should you get credit for that? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good only to those who do good to you, why should you get credit? Even sinners do that much. And if you lend money only to those who can repay you, why should you get credit? Even sinners will lend to other sinners for a full return. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Then your reward from heaven will be very great, and you will truly be acting as children of the Most High. For He is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate.
Now, before we get to the retelling part, the rest of the sermon would go on about not judging others. We talk about forgiving one another, generosity. We would say the student would not be greater than the teacher, but when they're fully trained, they'll become like the teacher. We'll say, don't be a hypocrite. We need to be aware of the log in our own eye. So a good tree produces good fruit. People are the same way. And then we'll talk about building on a solid foundation. Again, there's lots of overlap to what Jesus is teaching. Okay, now we're going to do this retelling part. This is how I want us to do. Instead of me just doing it, I'd like to try to do it together. As a big group. So this means to use your outdoor voices so we can hear each other. I'll start us off, but let's see if we can kind of, in summary, you don't have to nail it all. Put your phone slightly away from you. I see what you're doing. You can glance at it. I'm cheating a little too, so I'm not, you can't. But let's see if we can just, in summary, we don't, as long as your arm can extend. Let's start. Jesus comes down the mountain and he turns to the disciples and says, anyone? Louder. I don't think so, but good one. Maybe he did.
God blesses the poor.
Blesses the poor. Who else? There's the hungry. What's right? The meek, not this one, not in this one. Weeping. It's a little bit. Again, he's a little bit more concise in this one. Essentially, he said there's a reversal of things that will happen. You know, the kingdom of God will be theirs. If they're hungry, they will be, yeah. And those who are weeping will laugh. There we go. There's blessing to the one who is, persecuted, hated, excluded, mocked, cursed. They will be, starts with an H? Happy. Because their reward is in heaven. But they were going to be, especially if they were to be treated like who? Prophets, right. Jesus continues the reversal talk. Sorrow awaits for the
Rich.
and prosperous and the mockers. He encourages those who are listening to do this to their enemies. Right. And do good to those who hate you. Bless and pray for those who. Yeah, that's it. Hurt, curse. What happens if you're slapped? Someone wants your coat. What's? Yeah, he didn't mean today. Give to those who? It's really simple. Yeah, or ask. If something is taken, don't try to. Right. No revenge or vengeance. Do to others. What about only showing love to those who you love?
Anybody.
Who should we show love to as well? Who are we supposed to lend to?
People who can't pay us back.
Yeah. Lend without expectation of return. Where's the reward? In heaven. And we are to be what like God? Like just like God is? The Word. We are to be compassionate. So, that's kind of what we got in a nutshell of what's going on there. There's some deep stuff in there. Now, there's a few things before we get to the time we're going to speak together that I just want to note. Because it's good to sit in chapter 6 for a while. There's two things that jump out for me that I find noticeable. One is the idea of characteristic or distinctions of being a Jesus follower, a citizen in God's kingdom. Something that stands out a little different approaches. One of those examples would be turning the other cheek when slapped, or giving your shirt as well when they want your coat. The thing is, Jesus is speaking into or giving other options to very familiar responses. I'm going to get this name wrong, but it's Taka Temujin, who writes for the South Asian Bible Commentary. He would say things like this. Things like the zealots. They would opt for a revolutionary response or revolutionary violence to counter the oppressive violence. So that was an option. Another option at the time was the Sadducees, who they would just collaborate with Rome. They were religious leaders at the time. There was the Essenes. We don't really talk a lot about them, but we know about them a lot because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were the ones who kept those. They were isolationists. They were stepped out of the social context. They went far away and just removed themselves completely. That's a response. There is the Pharisees, who overemphasized religious legalism and piety without being mindful at all about those who were crushed by the injustice of the Roman Empire. Jesus brought an alternative option, one that hopefully would produce transformation by overcoming evil by doing good. Even Luke, when we read that Luke 6:31, do to others as you have them do to you, we can see this as a distinctive. You might say, how do you see that as distinctive? Well, there actually was, Jesus is reframing a very widely known teaching at that time. One would have been called from Hillel Elder. The other was found in the book of Tobit, which would have been Jewish literature. The book of Tobit says, and what you hate, don't do to anyone. Hillel's teaching was basically just taking that, running off that, what is hateful to you, don't do to another fellow. Now, it's similar, but there's a bit of a distinction. One focuses on how we're going to treat someone, and the other talks about what we're going to refrain from doing. It's a subtle distinction, but it's a distinction. One is inaction. One is action. So there's that difference. Stands out from what a lot of people would have understood. They might have recognized, do to others what you would want done to yourself. They would say, but that's a little bit different than we're used to hearing. I'm supposed to not do what I don't like to others, but now you're saying to actually do. And then, this is going to be in the question there, note the context of the golden rule. It seems to be surrounded by enemy love. Made it a little harder. The other thing is reversal. when it comes to values. Those who had a lower societal status were seen with little value, whether it was economically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, physically, relationally. Likely a combination of many of these, if not all of them. Now, to understand why they were seen that way, it wasn't just like, oh, we do not like poor people. This is a big deal, reversal of values. They were seen as, I wonder what they did to deserve that. That would have been the cultural understanding, because it was seen as, if you were wealthy, the blessing of God, you must have done something right. If you had some sort of ailment, poverty, what did you do wrong? And we kind of get that notion if you go to John 9:2. And these were the disciples. They actually said to Jesus, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because his own sins or his parents' sins? So that's a reversal of values. Again, I think sometimes we can miss how revolutionary Jesus was talking about that at that point, because they would have said, hey, what did they do wrong? And like even the thought of that is kind of weird, because it's like, in my mind, it's like, why is this person blind? Is it something, was he born blind? Is it something he did? He was born that way. When did he do the thing? That's how steep they would have been in it. So the fact that Jesus is saying, blessed are those whose society would have looked at as, they probably have done something, we can throw them a few shillings or whatever here or there, but they did it. I mean, I'm not going to argue with what God did there. Now God is saying, blessing. These are just a couple things that I find kind of notable in this. Distinctions and values. What stands us different? And what does that mean for us today? It's really good to sit there and wrestle with Luke 6, to understand what that looks like today, to understand that it could be harder than we realize. And it is even today, I would say in some cases, kind of revolutionary. Because we still have a mind, if someone's going through a hard time, what did they do wrong? Did they do it to themselves? And find out sometimes that's actually not all what happened. That's just life. And the fact that distinctions are we really good at enemy love in the way it looks like, in the way Jesus presents it, or are we really good at reading chapter 6? And if you're overwhelmed, something I shared with Joe this last weekend, I believe, and it was something I feel like I said it was like I need to write this down because I need to listen to it. He just was very overwhelmed by the world. And he basically just said, I don't know how to fix it. And then I just started to talk to him, feeling is just as overwhelmed as he is. And said, when I was your age, I didn't have the news of the world inundated at me. It was the newspaper and the television. There were selected times those were available, and I had to intentionally go to it to happen. Now, you're hit with it no matter where you go. That's overwhelming. But here's the thing I think what made it easier, why I wasn't as overwhelmed back then as now. I was only worried about the 1% that was in front of me. Mine wasn't to deal with all of the things. I can only deal with what kind of placed before me. So I'm only going to do the 1%. And as we talk about some of the stuff in Luke 6, and we talk about how to love your enemy, which is a hard thing to do. Don't worry about trying to solve the world or solve all of the church. Worry about the 1% right in front of you. Just that. That's it. Because if we all worry about our 1%, we do it together and we encourage each other, like 10%, things start to happen. So, take some time. I'm going to pray before we start, and then we'll do that, and Ron will come up after maybe about 10 so minutes, 15 minutes, again with these questions. Two things. One, you don't have to answer them all. Two, you don't even have to answer them in order. If you're on there as the facilitator, you've got the control. If you're like, oh, I want to jump into this question, you can jump right to that question. There's no somehow one question building on the other. I want to pray, and then we will, Ron will come back up here with communion. Lord, let us lead off with a foot of compassion. Lord, let the foundation we lean on be humility, and let your light shine on what it is we need to see, both in ourselves and those around us. Help us to grow and apply. Amen.